All right, guys. Lecture 9.2, handling events and data. It really feels like I'm on a radio show here, so you know, I guess what do they say? Click to subscribe. I guess I don't know. I don't know. I can give you some virtual copy or something like that. But here we are. We're doing the second part to this lecture, and it's about handling events and data. And let's see here if I can get this thing going here. So topics are we're going to be talking about handling events. We're going to be talking about React and events, DOM events versus React events, the prevent default on these events, and event binding, and then how to pass arguments and event handlers. And then after that, we're going to deal with handling data, mostly with Axios. That Axios plugin that is so popular. There's another one called Fetch, but we're not going to talk about that one for now. So we're going to talk about events. And so when we're talking about handling events in React, we got to remember that React is best in highly interactive user interfaces that deal with events. We talked about so much when we were talking about Node.js about how that guy Ryan Dahl thought let's take all that event driven kind of approach in the browser and client side UI and let's put it to the server side, which was quite an innovative take on everything. But we're talking about client side right now, and client side is all event driven, right? When you select the drop down, when you click a button, all these are events and they all trigger things. And what makes React shine is how it uh, deals with this event driven design, and kind of maybe improves on it somewhat with its virtual DOM and these types of things to make it super fast. So when we're talking about handling events, it's very similar to DOM events, but there is some syntactic differences. So these are little gotchas that you're going to have to remember when you're using this stuff. And believe me, when I started using this, or even to this day, I'll forget because I go back to vanilla JavaScript. Again, you got to remember in JSX that you're going to be using camel case rather than lowercase. So on the right here, you have HTML on click, and normally natively you would always lowercase that. You get in that habit that on click is always lowercased, and even how you wire up that event, that's going to be, we're going to talk about that in the next slide, but you can't wire it up in that way. You can't invoke it in that way with the parentheses and the double quotes. On the right side, the React side, is that on click is camel case with that capital C. Otherwise, JSX will cause a problem because it won't know what to do with that, or it'll cause some other issues. So, and also if you'll notice that activate lasers, activate lasers, we're in Star Trek. Activate lasers method has to be encapsulated in those mustaches, those curly braces that will signify an expression, and then React JSX will evaluate that expression, which hopefully activate lasers is a function somewhere and it does something cool, I would hope. Otherwise, I don't know why you would call activate lasers unless you were, I don't know, doing something with the database or something like that. Whatever you want to name your functions, name them in a way that actually is descriptive of what they do. If you have an application that has lasers in it, all the power to you. I'd like to see it. Uh, but for that intents purposes, that's how we're going to pass event handlers a little bit differently. So with JSX, we pass a function as the event handler rather than a string. So the DOM events. So the DOM events, which we've talked about, is that client-side events that we're used to that are generated by the browser. All browsers provide an event-based programming model, like we talked about already. All those event-driven models to the API. Anything you can think of that you're used to with an application is always triggers something else, right? Otherwise, we would have a very flat, static UI that can't do much. Everything with the user experience is all based on some type of event. So React provides a normalized event abstraction called synthetic events. Now, what are synthetic events? I had to look this up. actually, let me use this speaker notes, which I should be using this all the time. I only started using this right now. So what a synthetic event is it's a cross-browser wrapper around the browser's native event. So it has the same interface as the browser's native event, including that stop propagation, if you don't know what that is. Basically, you can stop propagating down. It's kind of like bubbling. Like they would say sometimes event delegates bubble up. Sometimes you might have a click and it might bubble up all the way to the event tree and cause some very weird side effects. So in a way, you can stop that propagating up or down by calling it. If you have a problem like that, maybe you have some button that is very nested down in another component, and you want to leave that button click to affect that component. You don't want it bubbling all the way up and affecting some parent click handler up at the top. You may have not run into that situation, but you can stop the propagation of that at the root level by calling e.stop propagation. So we are not going to be dealing that with, right now. We'll talk about event e.prevent default, which is another thing entirely. But basically, we're trying to say that synthetic events work identical across all browsers, but what the synthetic event that React uses has very high performance by using something called event delegation. So if you don't know what a delegate is, basically it's like I had a hard time understanding this at one time, but it's like two cans with a string attached, and you're calling across that kind of that channel, and basically you're that's the delegate, a pipeline, and you're triggering an event across that pipeline, and you have somebody on the other end that's going to handle your request or your event, right, in that way. So they basically delegate the responsibility of the event using that pipeline, and in that way it's supposed to achieve a much higher performance than the native DOM event. I don't know if that's too complicated of a description, but that's a little bit of a description of what a synthetic event is, because to be honest, I needed to know that, because when you're talking about synthetic events, it's like, okay, you need to know a little bit about exactly what that is. So DOM events are the events that receive and react to this synthetic event object. So basically, you just got to know it's a wrapper, and React uses that delegation to call the underlying DOM event. So you just got to know it's faster. I don't have to tell you. But one note to say there is you cannot return false to prevent default behavior. So sometimes, very often, you will actually do this in plain JavaScript. You'll have a click event, and you'll do a function where you want to click the link and return false, meaning you don't want that event to trigger something else. Like if you're inside of a form and you click the submit button, you want to take control of that. You want to take control of that event without triggering a postback of the form, right? It's like you are preventing the default behavior of the browser is to handle that form submission and post back or do something. You want to take control of that and stop the post back. So you could do this in normal JavaScript. On click, returning false basically will just not trigger a post back or a reload. It'll just console log. So, but unfortunately in React, you cannot just use that return false. You got to do something else. You got to use prevent default. So this is another important difference, is you cannot return false as we stated. You have to use the prevent default behavior in React. So you must call on that synthetic event prevent default explicitly. So if we have an action link here, so if you look at here, we have some component, small component called action link, functional component. Inside of the JSX, it has a link and just a normal link that has a blank reference, and it has a JavaScript handler, which is camel cased, and then has our event handler, which again is not invoked or in a string. It's a handler, a reference to a handler, and inside of that handler, the synthetic events get passed through, and we do this event dot prevent default, and then we have console log was clicked. So pretty much the browser may handle that normal that link by doing something with the page. Now we are stopping the browser from its default behavior, and basically when you click that link, you're just going to get a bunch of console log messages going on that the link was clicked. So that's what that means. So you got to remember, you got to use this, otherwise you're going to get some weirdness happening. So component events. So a common pattern for class components is for an event handler to be a method inside of the class. So this one is important because I've made this mistake many times. You need to ensure that this, so it's in some next slides, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but basically this is a class component called logging button. Again, it extends React component, but in order to put an event handler in there, you have to wrap it in this way. If you notice, it's actually an arrow. It's actually an error function. It's an arrow function, and you're basically wrapping the callback in this way to bind it. If you don't do this, it won't. Inside of the class component, it won't trigger that handle click. If you just have on click, curly braces, this dot handle click, this dot handle click may not be bound all the time, and you get some weird behavior. You get a dead link, and you don't know why, and then you have to wrap it in this way. So we'll discuss a little bit more why, but you just have to remember if your class components are not working, you need to do this pattern to wrap the method. So here's a little bit of a bigger example of a toggle class. And like I said, you have to be very careful about the meaning of this in JSX callbacks. Uh, just know that. It's just a problem with binding. If you don't bind this handle correctly and pass it to onClick, it'll be undefined when the function's called. So the problem is it being undefined. So in this example, we got a toggle class component. We're using our constructor, our class constructor, we're passing props in, we're doing it the right way. Then we're calling the base class with props. So we're passing that. It's all good, a good pattern. And then we're setting state in the constructor, this dot state. So we have a flag called is toggle. We're setting to true by default. So when this class is instantiated, we got the state toggle is on. And then we're doing this bind. Now this right here is an alternative method to the arrow function. I personally don't like this one a little too much because I'm used to the other pattern, but here the binding is necessary to make this work in the callback. So right up front, we're kind of binding this handler. We're binding it to itself basically. It's like an extra step. I don't like this pattern, but this is on the prototype, and this is another way of doing it. But if you don't do this, you'll get undefined. So if you look, there's a handle click function method. Sorry, a method to the class, a class method. It's not a function. It's not a function inside of a functional component because we're inside of a class, and we need to call it a method, like object oriented. So it's a method that's going to toggle the state. So it's going to take the current state and toggle it on or off. But the real thing in what we are looking at is the on click in the render, and we're basically evaluating this dot handle click, and we're going to do something with the state. But basically what we're saying is if we don't bind it like that, and if we're not using the arrow function, it may be undefined. We just have to know that, because then we're just going to get a dead link, and we're not going to understand why. But I don't like this pattern as much because I think it's a bit of a hassle. So if you don't want to use the bind method, you can wrap the event callback in an arrow function. So this is the pattern I'm more used to. It's a little shorter. You just have to get some context of why we're doing this. So here we have the same logging button class. We have a method called handle click. Inside of the render, we ensure that this is bound. So we use that arrow function and we wrap the event handler inside of it. So now when we click it, it evaluates correctly and it binds this correctly. So you need to know about this with class components because I guarantee you'll run into this problem where the link is broken and you won't know why. So passing arguments to our event handlers. So this is the way you would do it. So again, these two calls are equivalent. The arrow function pattern, like we talked about, and then there's the underlying function.prototype.bind. That's a little bit more syntax. Again, it's your preference. These are both equivalent. It's up to you what you want to do. Again, E represents that synthetic event in both cases. So in the arrow function, we just want to note that you have to pass E because you're basically you have more you're basically kind of hacking it in a way. You have more control, but you got to take control of this by using this pattern. The bind, it's automatically forwarded. The event is already built into that call to that method, so that any further arguments after the ones that you define, they will be automatically forwarded. So the synthetic event will automatically be forwarded. You don't have to put it as a parameter inside of your event handler. So we're going to talk about next working with data, and we are going to working with data. All right, well, you didn't see that, but through the power of technology, I was able to pause my video and then resume it. So if there was a blip there, that's why. So anyhow, working with data. I guess one of my sponsored calls, they want me to, now that I have a channel, they want me to push something. I don't know what it was. It was something to do with coffee grinds or something like that, but I'm not going to do it. All right, so when we're talking about Axios, we're talking about Axios, not Delta Force. I don't know why, I just wanted to put that picture in there just because the guy is riding a motorcycle with rockets on it. I mean, you can't beat that, really. I mean, if you've never seen that movie, he's got rockets on his motorcycle and machine guns, 2 machine guns in the front. So, like I said before, try to get The Rock to beat that. Okay, so we're talking about Axios. I got to entertain myself here while I'm talking to my computer by myself. So Axios, we're going to talk about Axios. So that's the RESTful API. I am probably there is a Delta API out there. I haven't heard of it, but I heard of Fetch API. So Axios is the RESTful API that we're going to use. It's really lightweight. It's based on the AngularJS service, and it's similar to Fetch API, as I said. You can really use Axios with just plain JavaScript, ES6. You don't need to wrap it in a very complicated framework like React. So you can just use it directly in your JavaScript. It's that lightweight. It's promise-based. We can take advantage of async await if we want to, if we want to make asynchronous code. And there's a lot of intercept and cancels on requests. There's a lot of built-in CORS. If you don't know what CORS is, it's cross-site, cross-forgery protection. And again, we can include Axios in our React project by installing with npm install axios-save, and then we got access to it. It has all the verbs out of the box, everything you need: get, put, delete, patch, option, and another one. If we don't want to use async await, make sure to use those promises, and we can handle the errors, and we can use the .den chaining and all that stuff. So it's good to know. So if we're going to use this in our React project, if we're going to use it, we can use Axios just simply with the .get, and it has, again, promise-based. So you have the .then, and you have the callback, and you can deal with the response. So you can handle the success, you can catch the errors, and you can dig into the errors a little bit, and obviously you have a finally on that chain. There's 2 ways here that you can actually use it. You can pass the ID in the query string, or you can actually give it a payload if you have a bigger object you want to do. So you can actually use params and pass an ID that way. Just a little reference on the post request. So you can use axios.post. You can set the endpoint, the RESTful endpoint, and again you can pass the parameters in that fashion. If you're looking to find a user named Fred Flintstone, if you don't know what the Flintstones are, you got to look up that show, because you gotta watch that show. It's quite funny. Anyhow, look it up. Again, then you can handle the response, and then catch, you can grab it. So pretty simple API, to be honest. You can use it for whatever you need. Obviously, in the .then, you're gonna grab the response. If all goes well, you're gonna map it to your collection, whatever you're gonna show. You can use you can use the set state. We'll show a little example of that. So again, a cool thing about it is you can actually do multiple concurrent requests. Again, because it's promise-based, right? We had that promise.all. If you remember, that promise.all on ES6 will actually go through and wait until all of the promises are resolved. And only then, when they're finished, will it go through and then finally handle the result. So that's kind of cool. It actually, because get user account returns a promise and get user permission returns another promise. Axio has it built in the same fashion to handle both promises when they resolve or complete. Only then will it then deal with it. Axios.spread, I imagine now it probably goes through those and does something with it. Look up Axios.spread. So, but the point is, both requests are now completed at the same time in case you needed the account information and the permissions at the same time to then do something with it. This is what you would do to do that. You can also use asynchronous calls here. So just a little reference there. If you wanted to use that GitHub API that we used, you would do it axios.get and handle the promise, and then on the response you have response.data and the login, you console log it. But in the same fashion, you can use an async function with the async keyword, and then set the response using the await keyword, and you're off to the races, right? You can asynchronously handle that so that your code is non-blocking. If you remember what non-blocking was, and blocking versus non-blocking, asynchronous versus synchronous, all that stuff we talked about in Node.js, again, it applies here. I just wanted to show this because it kind of shows our integration with Axios with React. We did something like this previously in one of our labs. So if we had a user list class that extends React component, of course we set the state right away at the top. That should actually be inside of a constructor up there. Then let me just use my pointer here. So up here, this should really be in a constructor, a class constructor, and we should have having props and then calling the base constructor of React.component, so super and props. Then inside of this lifecycle event, component.didMount, we have a call. So when the component mounts, when it loads up, when it renders by the DOM, we're calling this .users, and we're not calling it in the constructor. You really shouldn't call a GET request in a constructor. You should actually call it within the lifecycle events. Know that because I see that all the time. I see it all the time in project code and things that are submitted, right? Put it inside of the lifecycle events, not when the class is instantiated, right? Keep it out of the constructor. The constructor should be defaulting and setting up some of those things and not making RESTful API calls. All right, so inside of this get users, we have axios.get, of course, going to JSON placeholder.typicode users, and then we're using the promise-based approach, .then. We're using the arrow function for res, the response. We're setting constant users to res.data, and then we're doing this .state. So we're updating the state that we set up here, which is an empty array. We're getting a response back. We're setting that. So now we have a response. So when we go to render it, we have some component here. We won't talk about that, but we're using our this.state.users, which is an array, and then on the prototype we have the map function, and then for each element we're outputting the name. So we're going and fetching some users from a database, from an API, and then when we get the data back in the promise, we are mapping it to state. When it renders, because state has been updated, the render will call again with the data. So if you loaded it with empty and it took a little while for the data to come back to you, the whole component will the render, because the state has been rendered, right? The state has been updated, so then React is smart enough to know that I need to render this div that shows all of the users now, right? So when you loaded the component, it had nothing, and then maybe as it came slowly back, then maybe a couple seconds later or a minute later, the data came and it refresh your grid with newly populated data. So that's what that does. All right, moving on. So just want to talk about config options again. Just give some reference of what Axios can do. We're doing a shallow dive. There's a lot it can do. If you want to spend time digging into the reference and all that stuff, be my guest. So there are some config options on this stuff. So you can pass headers, you can pass parameters. So the header is a key value pair. Params, you can serialize them and append to array. Response type, if you don't want it to be JSON, you want to change it to what, I don't know what a blob is, but if you want to change it to a blob, I didn't know that was response type, but that's what the documentation says. Array buffer, a stream, authentication, right? If you want to authenticate with a JWT token or something like that, some basic authentication is all built in. a simple GET request with the JWT token for those of you that are very keen and you want to try to do this with your project, by all means, so this is a way if you wanted to protect your routes a bit, you could pass a JWT token in the config option of the headers. So in the header, you have an authorization property and you can set the bearer token. So this is a way you would do it. A post request with some config options, this is an example here. Now this is a little bit smarter. We actually extracted the config out of the post, so it's cleanly explained here that the config is an object that has headers. The content type is going to be this format, URL encoded. The response type is blob. I gotta look that up, to be honest. I should have some explanation on that. Axio.post. So now we're going to post to our endpoint. We're going to pass our data and we're going to pass our config, which is right here, and then we're going to grab the response. So it just shows you that you can actually have a lot of configuration options in this. And that kind of wraps up Axios. We talked about working with event handlers and component events, and then we talked about working with data and how we can use data with Axios, and ideally tie it into our component lifecycle. Don't be putting it in the constructor. All right, and that's a wrap.